They decided the signal was noise. From the Council command ring, the besieged world was already a solved equation. Orbital grids collapsed. Surface resistance reduced to pockets measured in minutes. Evacuation tallies froze at 18.7 million civilians. Stranded below, their transport windows closed by blockade geometry the Council had perfected over centuries. Victory projections ran clean and green. The war was over. Then the distress beacon arrived. It cut across priority bands with the blunt simplicity of desperation. An automated SOS repeating on civilian frequencies and military fallback channels alike. Location confirmed. Population confirmed. Threat classification confirmed. The message appended a timestamp that told the real story. Launched 42 minutes too late to change anything. A junior liaison flagged it out of procedure. The chamber responded with thin smiles. Late signals were common. Hope always lagged behind physics. The Council logged the SOS as irrelevant and returned to post-action accounting. Archive it, an admiral said. The lesson stands. They reviewed the hypothetical responders anyway, for form. Nearest Allied fleets were hours out. Independent mercenaries would not risk Council interdiction. And then there was the outlier, humanity. A marginal polity from a high-gravity death world. Known for layered armor, visible kinetics, and inefficient designs. Response time projections populated the display and drew laughter. Too late to matter. Someone said, humanity's profile flickered up thick holes, low elegant scores, no sanctioned energy lattice. Their ships were catalogued as relic adjacent. Survivable only by excess mass and stubborn crews. Council doctrine dismissed such designs as wasteful, a sign of technological immaturity. If humans answered at all, they would arrive after the last resistance burned out. The Council allowed the possibility only because procedure required it. Too late. The tag appeared beside the SOS file. Never meant for the record. On the tactical feed, Council vessels tightened their orbits. Fire missions concluded. Surface grids went dark in expanding rings. The besieged world's final transmission broke into static, then silence. Council casualty estimates updated AXEP table. The admirals leaned back, already composing the after-action language that would justify it as stabilization. Another aide noted a sensor blip far beyond the perimeter, flagged by deep-range E-rays for unusual transit geometry. It was dismissed as background traffic, an artifact of civilian lanes bending around the battle volume. The Council did not hunt phantoms. When the outcome was decided, they returned to ceremony. Commendations queued. Jurisdiction notices drafted. The galaxy would be reminded, again, that resistance only prolonged suffering. We won. The standalone line flashed on a private display. Confidence condensed to 4 characters. No one watched the deep-brained feed long enough to notice that the anomaly. Resolved into disciplined signatures 6 to 7, of them dropping from transit in tight temporal sequence. No one recalculated the response window when the distance counters began falling faster than doctrine allowed. The SOS file remained. Archived, stamped, and closed. By the time the first human holes crossed the outer marker, the Council had already moved on to governance. They believed the rescue impossible because it violated their timetable, their models, their sense of finality. The signal had been ignored. What the Council did not yet understand was that some fleets did not answer hope. They answered obligation, and they were never late. They answered before the council finished celebrating. Human ships. Translated into real space without flare or announcement. 67 holes resolving along the outer marker in disciplined silence. No ceremonial spacing. No display arcs. They arrived already aligned, vectors clean, distances precise. The council command ring paused as sensors recalibrated, annoyed more than alarmed. Late arrivals were common. Late rescues were pointless. Council channels opened automatically. Authority statements flowed in familiar cadence, explaining jurisdiction, security actions, and the consequences of interference. The language was polished, patient, and absolute. The humans were informed that the operation was complete, the system secured, and unauthorized forces were to withdraw beyond 1.5 million kilometers immediately. The human reply came before the statement. Finished rendering it, forced priority with blunt efficiency, narrow band, undecorated. No anthem, number, emblem. The visual resolved into a functional bridge-dark compact, built for endurance rather than spectacle. A human officer stood centered, hands folded behind their back, posture relaxed, eyes steady. We acknowledge the distress call, the officer said. We are responding. A council envoy interrupted, irritation creeping into their voice, reiterating authority and casualty projections. The human officer did not raise their volume. The evacuation is not complete. They said, there are 18.7 million civilians still planetside. We are here for them. The chamber stirred. A senior admiral gestured, amused. That population is under council jurisdiction, they said. Your intervention is unnecessary and unauthorized. The human officer inclined their head slightly. Your jurisdiction is noted, they said. It is not recognized. Not recognized. Translation checks ran twice. The phrase held council doctrine shifted to compliance framing. Timelines appeared. Acknowledge authority in 180 seconds. Power down in 360. Prepare to be escorted out of the system in 600. The disparity. Graphic rotated again 10,000 council vessels against 67 human ships. The math was meant to speak for itself. We are not contesting your numbers, the human officer said. We are contesting your outcome. Silence followed, brief and sharp. At 240 seconds, the officer continued, voice unchanged. We will open evacuation corridors. Any council vessel that interferes will be treated as hostile. Any vessel that stands down will not be fired upon. The council envoy laughed, openly now. You are too late, they said. The world is lost. We disagree, the human officer replied. The image zoomed out slightly, enough to show. Motion behind the officer stations coming alive. Status lights shifting from standby to green. Across this tactical display, human ships adjusted vectors by fractions of a degree. Acceleration curves rising smoothly, deliberately, not aggressive. Intentional, at 180 seconds, Council protocol required a final authority declaration. It transmitted. Automatically. The human officer waited until the last clause rendered, then spoke once more. We do not claim this system, they said. We do not seek battle. We are here because someone asked for help. Help was requested. The standalone line propagated through human channels. Logged as doctrine rather than rhetoric, the channel closed. Council commanders queued fire orders, with professional boredom, confident the interruption would end in moments. On the surface below, evacuation sirens began sounding again as human corridors lit up on civilian maps. Wide and unmistakable. The answer had arrived. Whether the Council accepted it or not was no longer relevant. The first volley was meant to end the interruption. Council gunnery officers selected forward batteries and authorized a demonstration. Strike at 22,000 kilometers. Energy output capped at 20%. The beams lanced out in disciplined alignment. Spectra tuned to overload shields and burned through holes that lacked modern lattice. The command ring watched with practiced detachment, expecting collapse. The beams struck the lead human ships and vanished, not deflected, not scattered, absorbed. Light washed across layered armor and drained into the voids between plates, bleeding away through channels the Council's sensors could not map. Thermal spikes flared and flattened within a second. Radiation bleed through, dropped below background. Human power curves did not spike or dip. They remained steady, stubbornly low. No effect. Analysts reran the data. A second volley followed immediately, this time from 6 cruisers. Output raised to 35% and frequency staggered to induce resonance failure. The human ships did not maneuver. They did not raise visible shields. They held Vecca and took the fire squarely, outer layers blackening as ablatives sacrificed themselves by design. Efficiency calculations populated the displays. 90.8% absorption. Revised to 92.1 as more telemetry resolved. The numbers stabilized and refused to move. Murmurs crept through the chamber. An admiral ordered escalation. 12 ships fired at 50%, then a battleship-class emitter joined at 65, breaching peacetime limits for 3.6 seconds. The battle space was nothing but glare energy bright enough to cast hard shadows across Council hulls thousands of kilometers away when the light cleared. The human formation was still there. Armor sections had sloughed away in sheets, tumbling harmlessly into vacuum. Beneath them, identical layers remained intact, aligned, unhurried. Internal temperature graphs peaked and fell in clean cycles. Life signs across the human fleet held steady. No decompression, no loss of control. It did nothing. The words escaped a junior officer before discipline caught them. The system logged the utterance anyway, flagged as emotional variance. At 70% output, Council weapons began to strain. Emitter housings overheated. Containment fields wavered. One cruiser broke formation to vent plasma, filing a damage report that cited thermal overload during sustained fire. The cause field auto-populated. Target resistance. The admirals ordered a brief pause to recalibrate firing solutions, irritation bleeding into their voices. During the lull, long-range sensors updated. The human ships adjusted vectors by measurable margins fractions of a degree, smooth and synchronized. Distances began to close from 2.4 million kilometers to 2.1. Council analysts tagged the movement as evasive repositioning. A mistake. The human flagship transmitted a single data burst, unencrypted and narrowband. Impact graphs filled Council. Displays, absorption curves overlaid firing profiles with clinical clarity. A short line of text sat beneath them, time-stamped and plain. Efficiency acceptable. Silence spread through the command ring. One final demonstration volley was authorized at 80% to restore authority and end the anomaly. As capacitors charged, an elder strategist studied the absorption curve, the way it flattened regardless. Vimpotan felt the first real discomfort of the engagement. Weapons were meant to provoke reactions, flares, panic, retreat. These targets offered none. Across the void, the human ships held their course, armor still steaming faintly as evacuation corridors widened behind them and civilian traffic began to move. The Council had fired to intimidate. Instead, it had measured itself and found the result wanting. They did not retreat when the firing paused. They advanced as Council capacitors climbed toward another escalation. The human formation changed state, not with flares or bursts, but with a smooth inflection in motion that sensors initially rejected as error. Acceleration curves rose in clean ramps. 6 grams, 8 grams. Values crossed thresholds the Council's medical models marked unsurvivable. The system recalibrated twice before accepting the truth. Sustained thrust stabilized at 12 grams across the lead elements, 12 G dot at that acceleration. Crews should have liquefied and hulls torn themselves apart. The humans closed distance from 22,000 kilometers to 16,000 in seconds. Vectors precise, profiles unwavering. Life sign telemetry remained flat. Structural stress stayed inside margins the Council insisted did not exist. The ships did not jink or spiral. They shortened the equation. Then the rest of the fleet moved. 67 hulls entered. Motion on distinct vectors, none matching another. Dispersion resolved into intent. Lines crossed and separated with millisecond timing. Ships sliding through volumes Council doctrine declared unsafe. Human vessels passed within tens of kilometers of Council hulls at relative velocities that stripped sensor vanes and scorched armor without a shot fired. Closing fast. Distance counters fell. 12,800 kilometers, 10,300, 7,900. Fire control solutions lagged as targeting systems. Chased acceleration profiles that did not spike or decay. At 12 grams, the humans did not outrun Council weapons. They outran the assumptions those weapons were built on. Council formations began to deform under proximity pressure. Orders to tighten arcs conflicted with orders to spread. Minor corrections cascaded into larger errors as human vectors occupied the Space Council ships needed to maintain elegance. One cruiser broke formation to regain spacing and found a human destroyer already sliding along the vector it required, passing its bow with meters to spare. Another clipped an alley's shield envelope, forcing both ships to veer and opening a gap 3 human frigates exploited immediately. The battle space lost symmetry. What had been clean arcs became crowded volumes of intersecting threat envelopes. Reaction piled on reaction. Space shrank. 4,500 kilometers. The human flagship cut thrust and pivoted broadside in a maneuver that should have sheared it apart. Inertial dampening held. Velocity bled in a controlled burn that placed the ship squarely across the projected paths of 3 Council command vessels at once. Gunnery crews fired on reflex. Beams carved through vacuum the human ship no longer. Occupied half a second later. An elder strategist saw it then. This was not a charge. It was timing. Every acceleration ramp, every cutoff, every fractional degree adjustment forced the Council to react, and reaction stacked errors faster than doctrine could correct them. The humans were collapsing formations without firing. At 3,200 kilometers. The human fleet settled into geometry, the Council's models flagged as unstable and fatal. Weapon ports irised open along armored spines, dark, mechanical, unapologetic. The sight carried no flourish. It carried inevitability. No room. Left orders followed in rapid contradiction. Hold, spread, advance, withdraw. Compliance with any one violated the others. The humans issued no taunts and no new demands. They held position, acceleration steady. Timing exact, evacuation corridors widening behind them as civilian traffic surged through. The distance counters stabilized. Lines locked. The Council had trusted space to protect it. In that moment, it learned that space favored those born to gravity, trained under load, and willing to apply mass and velocity with disciplined restraint. The first kill was logged before. The evacuation clocks reset. Human fire control resolved solutions across 3 Council command vessels now trapped inside. 3,500 kilometers. Their elegant hulls struggling to reorient without colliding with escorts or evacuation corridors. The humans did not hurry. They waited until vectors aligned, until probability bands collapsed into certainty. Then the railguns fired. There was no flash, no warning glow, just mass released at speed. 8 tungsten penetrators left the human. Flagships, spinal rails at a measured fraction of light speed, spaced 0.12 seconds apart to defeat predictive interception. Council sensors registered impacts before crews understood weapons had discharged. The first rod punched through layered shielding and ignored it, momentum carrying straight through the command cruiser's forward hull. The second followed the same path. Pressure collapsed. Power grids failed in sequence. The ship split along stress lines, never meant to carry kinetic load. 1-dot missiles followed, not as a wave, but as math. Human destroyers launched them in packets. Of 9, each missile running a distinct guidance logic. Some burned hot and obvious, drawing point defense fire. Others coasted cold, invisible until terminal phase. Council interceptors chased the loud decoys and celebrated green markers. The quiet missiles arrived untouched at 2,900 kilometers. A second command vessel attempted to rotate its shield, envelope toward the human advance, overcorrected under conflicting orders, and exposed its ventral plane. 5 railgun rounds arrived through that opening. A 6th struck milliseconds later, delayed by design to exploit the pressure differential. The gravity ring sheared free and continued spinning, intact and useless, while the rest of the ship collapsed inward. Life signs dropped from 11,400 to 2.0 in under 4 seconds. 2 Council admirals shouted for withdrawal corridors. None existed. Human ships occupied the vectors required to escape, holding position with calm precision while evacuation traffic streamed past them in disciplined lanes. The 3rd command vessel fired wildly, energy lances splashing across empty space as gunners tried to force an opening without striking civilian transports. A human cruiser answered with missiles carrying limited yield nuclear charges, detonated. At calculated standoff distances, the blasts were shaped and directional, tuned to crush sensor re-rays and fracture hull integrity without vaporizing the ship outright. Systems died in layers. Structure remained mostly intact. Human targeting solutions dropped the vessel from the kill list. 3. Disabled. We count before we fire. The line appeared briefly on Council auxiliary channels, flagged as human doctrine. Analysts barely noticed. Too much else was failing. Council. Escorts attempted to screen what leadership remained, but the screen dissolved under kinetic pressure. Railgun fire did not saturate. It selected. Each shot removed a ship that mattered: flag bridges, coordination hubs, fire control relays, while lesser vessels were ignored long enough to understand what was happening. At 2,200 kilometers, a cluster of Council cruisers attempted a desperate ramming maneuver against a human destroyer, trying to trade mass for disruption. The destroyer adjusted thrust by 0.4 grams, slid aside, and let the cruisers collide with one another. Human sensors logged the impact as environmental hazard neutralization. No shots were fired. The battle clock crossed 21 minutes. Council command. Coherence fell below 45%. Fleet-wide orders degraded into local guesses and shouted corrections. Human losses remained unchanged. 0 destroyed hulls, 2 damaged, none mission killed. Ammunition tallies updated in clean columns. Railgun rounds expended, 47. Missiles launched, 163. Command vessels. Destroyed, 2. Disabled for capture, 1. Behind the firing geometry, evacuation counters rolled upward. Civilian transports cleared atmosphere in steady streams. Corridors held. Open by human hulls that took fire without returning it when stray shots crossed too close. The rescue did not pause for the killing, and the killing did not endanger the rescue. At 28 minutes, the firing slowed, not because targets were gone, but because the math was finished. The remaining Council fleet floated in disordered clusters, leaderless, weapons cooling, damage reports cascading faster than they could be read. Human ships held position, railguns silent, missiles cold. Boarding craft remained docked. Evacuation. Traffic continued uninterrupted, the numbers climbing past 12 million saved and rising. The Council had believed victory was decided by force concentration. Humanity demonstrated that rescue, applied with arithmetic precision, could dismantle an armada without ever losing sight of why the guns were firing in the first place. The guns fell silent while the corridors stayed open. At 28 minutes and 17 seconds, human fire control cleared every solution in the same breath. Rail capacitors bled charge into sinks. Missile locks dropped. Across the compressed volume of space, Council crews waited for the next calculation and did not receive it. Instead, a transmission unfolded outward from the human flagship, riding military bands, civilian relays, and emergency channels until it saturated the system. The image was simple. The same human officer from first contact, framed identically, posture unchanged. No triumph, no threat cadence. All offensive actions are paused, they said. Evacuation operations are ongoing. Council commanders braced for demands. None came. "We are broadcasting doctrine," the officer continued. Data panes opened beside them, stark and readable. First, civilians are protected. Evacuation corridors are inviolable. Any interference will be treated as a hostile act. Behind the words, maps updated in real time, lanes highlighted in clean green arcs. Transport counts climbed 12.4 million cleared, then 12.9. Second, surrender is protected. We protect the helpless. The line propagated through human channels and into the wider network, clipped and final. Any Council vessel that powers down offensive systems, transmits standard surrender codes, and holds position will not be fired upon. Boarding will be conducted only to secure weapons and render aid. Green markers spread across the tactical display as Council ships complied. Some hesitantly, others with visible relief. Human targeting excluded them instantly, even when it meant accepting suboptimal angles against remaining threats. Third, the officer said, the practice of chattel slavery is prohibited. The words landed without emphasis. Any vessel or installation engaged in the transport, ownership, or processing of sentient beings is designated a criminal operation. Survivors will be removed, evidence will be preserved. Across Council hulls, internal systems flared as registries lit red. Cargo manifests reclassified themselves. Holds long treated as routine suddenly appeared as crimes. A Council legal attach attempted to interrupt, invoking jurisdiction and emergency authority. The transmission did not pause. Jurisdiction does not extend to harm, the officer replied. Not today. Not ever. Numbers scrolled beneath the image, unemotional and precise. Civilians evacuated, 13.6 million and rising. Vessels surrendered, 312. Corridors open, 9. Time to full planetary clearance, 3 hours, 40 minutes. Human ships moved again, not toward targets, but toward people. Cutters slipped into evacuation lanes to absorb stray fire. Damage control drones, stabilized transports pushed beyond design limits. A human cruiser took a glancing hit meant for a civilian hauler and did not return fire, adjusting thrust to shield the lane instead, the officer concluded without flourish. We are here because someone asked for help, they said. If you stand down, you will be treated. If you interfere, you will be stopped. The transmission ended. In the quiet that followed, the Council confronted a reality it had not modeled. The battle had paused not because humanity lacked force, but because it had chosen restraint while millions were still moving to safety. The evacuation counters kept climbing. Protection, it became clear, was not a slogan. It was the reason the guns had fired and the reason they had stopped. The conclusion did not come from the battlefield. It came from those who had been watching. For patterns instead of victories. Coalition observers, bound by treaty to record and not interfere, began correlating the human response with archives that predated the Council's current borders. As evacuation corridors stabilized and human, ships held position with unnerving discipline. The data stopped, looking improvised. Human arrival vectors were not optimal for combat. They were optimal for response. Coalition analysts overlaid the jump-in points with historic distress routes, sold civilian lanes, decommissioned trade corridors, forgotten emergency beacons left behind by extinct polities. The alignment was exact. 67 human ships had not rushed toward the signal. They had emerged along a pre-mapped lattice designed to reach a threatened world within minutes. Not ours. They were already on station, a coalition tactician said quietly. Deep scan reconciliation confirmed it. Beneath civilian noise and background radiation, logistics nodes, surfaced like submerged structures revealed by a receding tide. Fuel depots hollowed into comets, medical stockpiles hidden in survey platforms, evacuation tenders disguised as freighters, their bays already configured for mass civilian intake. Carbon dating on the oldest installations forced multiple recalibrations before acceptance. 238 years. Some were older. This was the plan. The phrase circulated through encrypted coalition channels, never transmitted toward council space. This knowledge was not propaganda. It was orientation. Human doctrine, files long dismissed as sentimental posturing, from a Deathworld species resolved into something colder and more deliberate. Kinetic weapons were not chosen for dominance, but reliability under rescue conditions. Heavy armor was not for conquest, but to hold evacuation lanes under fire. Crews were trained for sustained acceleration, not to chase enemies, but to arrive where Fizzer said arrival was impossible. A coalition historian pulled a sealed record from 2 centuries earlier. A mining enclave erased without explanation after sending a final distress call. At the time, the disappearance had been attributed to piracy. The sensor residue, re-examined now, showed evacuation geometries and shielding signatures that looked uncomfortably familiar. They've been answering calls like this, someone said, quietly, wherever they could. The implication settled with weight. Humanity had not waited for alliances or permissions. It had built a doctrine around obligation. Distress signals were not requests to be evaluated. They were triggers. The response was automatic, pre-authorized, and prepared to override any authority that stood between civilians and survival. Coalition simulations branched and collapsed. In every credible scenario, human forces prioritized evacuation first, neutralization second, and governance last. Even failure states preserved civilian movement until the final moments. These were not war plans. They were rescue algorithms, hardened by centuries of rehearsal in council command wreckage. Survivors struggled to understand how victory had inverted so completely. In coalition space, the realization was sharper. Humanity had not intervened because it saw an opportunity. It had intervened because the signal existed, and answering it had been the plan all along. Neutralization resumed the moment the last evacuation. Lane cleared atmosphere. Human command reclassified the battle space in seconds. Hostile, surrendered, neutralized. The categories updated in real time, unforgiving and precise. Green-marked ships were excluded from every firing solution, even when they drifted through optimal kill corridors. Red-marked ships were addressed without further warning. Missile bays opened across the human formation. The launchers came in, waves measured, layered and silent until they weren't. Hundreds of signatures bloomed, then vanished as guidance systems shifted between hot burn and cold coast. The missiles did not converge on a single point. They flowed through space like a solved problem, dividing and recombining to occupy volumes council doctrine had never treated as simultaneously lethal. Point defenses reacted on instinct and failed on design. Interceptors chased loud decoys while the real warheads slipped through blind arcs created by overlapping shields and frantic maneuvering. At 6,400 kilometers, a council cruiser died with engines firing, hull torn apart by kinetic impact and internal overpressure. At 5,900, another lost power and rolled helplessly. Broadcasting surrender codes, seconds. Too late to cancel inbound fire already. Committed by logic gates that did not negotiate. The cascade began. Council captains watched their tactical displays. Drain read and made choices without guidance. Some powered down immediately, transmitting surrender on every frequency they could access. Human systems acknowledged them within milliseconds, flipping markers from red to green as missiles peeled away mid-course and retargeted without hesitation. Others hesitated, hoping to be overlooked. They were not Surin there, Cascade. The phenomenon propagated faster than any broadcast. Crews observed neighboring ships survive, surrender exactly as promised, and acted accordingly. At 18 minutes into the phase, surrendered vessels outnumbered hostile ones 2-1. At 33 minutes, 4-1. Boarding operations followed behind the missile waves, not as spectacle, but as process. Human cutters approached disabled hulls at controlled relative velocities, grappling points, locking with mechanical certainty. Breach teams moved in pairs, weapons slung low, medics between them. Resistance was sporadic and brief. When it appeared, teams sealed bulkheads, vented compartments, and waited. Gravity and air resolved what bravado could not dot. Do not fire on. Green dot the directive pulsed constantly across human channels. It was obeyed even when surrendered ships drifted into ideal firing geometry against still hostile targets. Gunners adjusted, sacrificing efficiency to preserve separation. The choice slowed the operation by minutes. No objections were logged. At 41 minutes, a council carrier attempted a mass launch, dumping strike craft in a last attempt to overwhelm defenses through saturation. Human response was immediate and impersonal. Defensive grids activated, not to annihilate, but to shape space. Electromagnetic pulses fired in patterned bursts, frying. Guidance systems without rupturing cockpits. Hundreds of fighters tumbled, powerless, pilots alive, instruments dead. Automated recovery beacons activated from the wreckage before the last. Craft stopped spinning, another cluster of heavy cruisers tried to form a defensive ring around a crippled logistics tender, their movements tight and emotional rather than calculated. Human analysis flagged the maneuver in under a second. Missile fire softened the ring just enough. Railguns punched precise holes through power cores, avoiding secondary detonations. The tender went dark without rupture. Boarding teams secured. It immediately began evacuating non-combatants from its holds. Throughout the phase, the human flagship held central position, its mass anchoring the geometry. Railguns fired sparingly now, each shot deliberate, removing ships that threatened evacuation corridors or endangered boarded hulls. Ammunition tallies updated in clean columns. Missiles expended 347. Railgun rounds 21 additional. Nuclear charges 0 in this phase. Human losses remained unchanged. Council resistance collapsed unevenly. Some captains fired until emitters overheated or hulls failed under cumulative stress. Others cut power in silence, their surrender codes arriving without words. Human systems treated them identically. Green markers spread until red became rare. At 72 minutes, the final organized hostile formation dissolved, its remaining ships powering down within a span of 20 seconds. The battle space did not erupt in celebration. It went quiet. Hundreds of council hulls drifted in ordered clusters, Weapons cold, damage reports queued, crews waiting. Human ships moved among them with methodical care. Repair drones stabilized. Compromised atmospheres. Traffic corridors were established to prevent collision. Boarding tallies finalized. Prisoners secured 4.3 million. Injured treated 512,000. Fatalities ceased entirely once the last hostile mark had disappeared. A council officer aboard a surrendered cruiser watched a human frigate alter course by fractions of a degree to shield their powerless hull from drifting debris and felt certainty drain away. Not replaced by fear, replaced by understanding. The Council's fleet had not been destroyed. It had been dismantled decision by decision, vector by vector until fighting no longer made sense. Relief replaced resistance with the efficiency of a practice drill. Human cutters docked with surrendered hulls, according to cues that ignored rank and favored need. Atmospheres were stabilized first, then gravity, then medical access. Injured crews were triaged without comment. Species tags flashing briefly before dissolving into the same priority schema. Analgesics flowed. Burns cooled. Hemorrhage counters dropped to 0. The work was fast, disciplined, and conspicuously indifferent to uniforms or banners. No reprisals. The directive propagated with the same authority as a firing order. Human Marines escorted prisoners with weapons slung low, restraints applied. Only where resistance had already occurred. Those who complied walked unbound. Those who did not were isolated, recorded, and transferred without raised voices. Every interaction generated data, biometrics, testimony, command lineage fed into a legal system already running at scale. Detention habitats unfolded from cargo holds, modular and sterile. Food met dietary requirements calculated to trace. Elements, translators rendered instructions in neutral cadence. Prisoner counts stabilized at 4.3 million. Fatalities did not increase. The numbers mattered, and the humans treated them like commitments rather than estimates. Across the system, civilian traffic resumed under human advisories. Relief convoys arrived on vectors cleared hours earlier, bearing markings from worlds that had never publicly aligned with Earth. Coalition observers watched manifests populate and recognized the shift before the announcements arrived. Neighboring systems were not waiting for invitations. They were choosing. Declarations came in batches. Suspension of council, tribute, opening of ports to human oversight. Requests for arbitration under the statutes broadcast during the evacuation. Political gravity shifted not with speeches, but with filings and signatures. Each time stamped, hashed, and verified. We accept these terms. The phrase repeated across multiple channels. Identical wording traced back to the doctrine packet released. Mid-batter, analysts flagged mimetic adoption. Human command did not respond. The system accepted the filings and moved on. Trials were scheduled before the last boarding action completed. Jurisdiction packets listed charges with unemotional clarity: enslavement, unlawful detention, command responsibility. Evidence hashes linked sensor logs to sworn testimony collected in real time. Command personnel flagged earlier. 189 individuals were separated and transferred under guard that neither tightened when they struggled nor softened when they pleaded. The guards had heard both before. An outer system governor attempted to negotiate. Amnesty in exchange for immediate realignment and resource access. The reply came from a legal officer, not a commander. Alignment does not erase crimes. They said it establishes the venue. The channel closed. Inside the habitats, rumors moved faster than fear. Crews compared treatment. They noticed surrender worked exactly as promised. They noticed no one was spaced, no compartments flooded, no reprisals taken for insults shouted in panic. The lesson settled unevenly, then held at 96 hours. The first liberated populations transferred off seized vessels. Families stepped into gravity they had not chosen, blinking under lights calibrated for comfort rather than efficiency. Civil agencies took over seamlessly as human medics stepped aside. Their role complete. The human flagship remained on station, scarred armor patched with clean plates that did not hide the damage. Its commander filed a final operational note. Evacuation complete. Neutralization complete. Care ongoing. In distant systems, leaders weighed the cost of defiance against the evidence streaming through every relay. The choice was no longer abstract, and it was no longer imposed. Humanity had not conquered territory. It had offered protection and shown, with meticulous restraint, why those who were saved chose to stand with it. The system settled into quiet that felt provisional. Wreckage fields stabilized into mapped orbits. Evacuation lanes closed and reclassified as traffic corridors. Trial dockets populated with the same priority once reserved for firing solutions. From a distance, the star looked ordinary again, as if violence had been a temporary distortion rather than a defining passage. Human sensors did not stand. Down, deep G rays continued their sweeps beyond the rim. Baselines stretched across. Millions of kilometers, listening for patterns that did not belong. At 119 hours post-neutralization, one array returned a contact that refused classification. It was faint, persistent, and wrong. Not a fleet, not a probe. A pressure in space-time that suggested motion without conventional drives. Analysts reran. The pass. The anomaly held that the source lay beyond mapped space. More than 40,000 astronomical units out, approaching on a vector that ignored trade lanes and jump corridors alike. Mass estimates fluctuated with each sweep, as if the object resisted agreement. Emission fragments matched partial records pulled from sealed. Archivist civilizations erased so completely their names survived only as warnings appended to margins. Exterminator. Signature. Human command convened without alarms. Relief operations continued uninterrupted. The information moved through channels older than the Council itself. Contingency headers unlocked. Timelines populated. The numbers were not comforting, but they were familiar. A coalition observer, cleared under emergency protocol, asked a single question across a secure link. Is this connected to the evacuation? The reply was measured. No, the human officer said. It predates it, meaning the rescue had not summoned the threat. Meaning the threat would have come regardless. The human flagship adjusted station by a fraction of a degree, aligning long-range sensors with the approaching anomaly. Around it, other human hulls mirrored the motion without instruction, geometry, settling into a configuration refined by repetition rather than debate. Ammunition tallies updated. Training rotations shifted. Messages went out to systems that had not yet chosen no threats, no promises, only data. Beyond the rim, something ancient continued its approach, indifferent to surrender codes and evacuation. Lanes unmoved by law or mercy. Its velocity did not change. Its signal did not waver. Humanity watched it with the same calm it had shown when answering the SOS. Then it began preparing corridors, again not for retreat, but for whoever might need saving next.